Hello and welcome back to A Bit of a Christie, the podcast where we examine the captivating world of Agatha Christie and use her works as a gateway to explore fascinating topics. First of all, I'd like to say a big thank you for your patience. It's been a while since our last episode and I truly appreciate all the support that the podcast has been shown. So thank you again. The novel we are focusing on today is the 1953 work, A Pocketful of Rye. We speak to Karen Pierce, an Agatha Christie enthusiast and author of a new recipe book called Recipes for Murder, 66 dishes that celebrate the mysteries of Agatha Christie. We're also stepping back into the shadowy streets of 1950s Paris to uncover the true twisted tale of Olga Duflos. I'm Hazel Jones, and this is A Bit of a Christie. In A Pocketful of Rye, Agatha Christie weaves an intricate web of mystery and intrigue. Join me as we step into the shoes of Miss Marple and revisit this classic tale. But before we dive into the story, let's set the stage by exploring the world in 1953. This year, Dwight D. Eisenhower was inaugurated as the 34th President of the United States, and Queen Elizabeth II ascended to the throne following the death of her father, King George VI. The government of South Africa introduced the apartheid system, segregating racial groups and institutionalising discrimination. Derek Bentley was hanged at Wandsworth Prison for the murder of PC Sidney Miles, a case which would be analysed for many years to come. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed in the United States after being convicted of espionage for passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. James D. Watson and Francis Crick announced that they had discovered the structure to the DNA module. Canada's first nuclear reactor, the National Research Universal, begins operations in Chalk River, Ontario, marking a significant milestone in nuclear research. A Pocketful of Rye, one of Agatha Christie's classic murder mysteries, is published, capturing the imaginations of readers worldwide. And Casino Royale by Ian Fleming is also released. New Zealander Edmund Hillary and Nepalese Tenzing Norgay became the first climbers to reach the summit of Mount Everest, a monumental achievement in mountaineering history. John Christie is hanged for a series of infamous murders at Rillington Place. This is also the year when murderer Rose West was born. The Samaritans charity was started and it would go on to help thousands of people in need. Tommy Taylor moved from Barnsley to Manchester United for the sum of £29,999, which made him the most expensive footballer to that date. Sugar rationing in the UK ended. Also greatly loved and admired comedian, actor, director and producer Victoria Wood entered the world. In the bustling office of the Consolidated Investments Trust, Miss Summers, the newest and least efficient typist, nervously attempts to make tea. Her sheepish expression mirroring her uncertainty about recognising a boiling kettle, an unending concern. She serves the tea with limp biscuits, but Miss Griffith, the experienced head typist, scolds her for the tepid water. She's exasperated by Miss Summers' reoccurring tea troubles. Amidst this, Miss Grosvenor, Mr. Fortescue's glamorous secretary, gracefully prepares his special tea. Mr. Fortescue, seated in his opulent office, receives it with indifference. Meanwhile, as the clock strikes 11:10, a sudden cry and a frantic buzz from Mr. Fortescue's office unsettles Miss Grosvenor. She discovers Mr. Fortescue in severe distress, convulsing and gasping for breath. He indicates at the tea being the cause. Terrified, Miss Grosvenor rushes to the typist's room, alerting them to Mr. Fortescue's dire situation. Responses vary. Some suggest medical remedies, while others fumble in confusion. They contemplate calling 999, but hesitate. Ultimately, they locate Mr. Fortescue's private address book, finding an address for Sir Edwin Sandeman. Ambulances arrive as Dr. Isaacs and Sir Edwin Sandeman make their way to the office, summoned by the frantic office boy and a series of phone calls. Will the hospital be able to save Mr. Fortescue? And what was the cause of this sudden illness? Was it really the tea? We will continue looking at the story of A Pocketful of Rye later in the show. But now for the first segment of our interview with Karen Pierce, an Agatha Christie fan and author who has written a brand new cookery book based on the mysteries of Agatha Christie. Hello, Karen, and thank you for joining us. If you wouldn't mind, would you like to introduce yourself to our wonderful listeners?
All right. Well, thank you for having me. My name is Karen Pierce, and I wrote a little book called Recipes for Murder, which is 66 recipes celebrating the novels of Agatha Christie.
How did the idea to write the book come about?
I'd always wanted to write a mystery, and I have indeed about 4 or 5 different half-written mysteries, because I'm really not very good at the whole doing the puzzle anywhere near as good as she. So I couldn't do it. And then one day I'm a bit of a cook anyway, but I've always wondered why there wasn't an Agatha Christie cookbook. I mean, there are cookbooks for Star Trek and Harry Potter and The Fast and the Furious even. And I just felt like, there really should be one. And what would it look like? And then I just started with my spreadsheets.
Food is actually really important in Agatha Christie novels, isn't it?
Well, yeah, because poison is. Because poison is such a huge part of her killing methods. And so she hides poison in food or drinks a lot. There's a very clever quip between Tommy and Tuppence Beresford where Tommy says, "Now, I hope you don't have anything evil in that casserole." But yeah, she uses food a lot.
Agatha Christie also uses food to set the scene within the book, isn't that right?
The original part of thinking about the cookbook was, how does Christie use food? Yes, she uses it to cover up poison and things like that to kill people. But more often than not, it's used as a plot device. It's used to set the scene of both the culture, the time period that it's happening in, and the class of people that we're talking about. The part of the world we're talking about. So she really uses food a lot that way. She also uses it very cleverly. Like, she's very concise with her words in descriptive ways. So she even uses food to characterize individuals, and she does it again in such a clever way in a short conversation that you know just exactly who that person is. A very good example for this one is in The Hollow, Lady Lucy Angatel is quite concerned about what's going to be for dinner after, one of their guests has been shot at lunch. She says to the butler or the cook, "I'm so glad we're having caramel pudding because it's not our favorite." And really, you don't want to have your favorite pudding when someone's been murdered at lunch.
With Agatha Christie being so well known, it does seem quite a gap, really, that there wasn't a recipe book out there. Were you able to find anything perhaps on the internet about that, or had anyone tried before?
I think I just picked up the Downton Abbey cookbook. And I couldn't figure out why there wasn't an Agatha Christie one. I searched, I Amazoned, I Googled. I mean, I know there's one in French, there's a French one. And somebody told me that there is an online one, but it's really, really, really hard to find somebody put it out of California 30 years ago or something. I've never found it. The French one I found, but that's it. There's nothing else. And I just thought that was a big hole. And I kind of wondered why. And then I started thinking about, well, how does Christie use food, and what would a cookbook look like? As I started to then reread them, because that's what I did. I reread them all and put little post-its every time somebody mentioned food. And then I would go back over and I would see, oh, well, so this really seems like an interesting quote, and this seems like an interesting way she's used food. So that's going to be it for this book. And then I just kept doing the same for all 66 books. Some were really easy because it was obvious, and some were really hard where I've taken a little bit of creative license with some of them. But yeah, then I had to research them all through old cookbooks and old newspaper articles that I would find, and all sorts of different ways. I found the recipes. Some I made up, some I already had in my collection, some I adjusted, some other people had in their collections. I mean, how to boil potatoes properly is not really a big secret. So most of the recipes are really, really very simple. That was my guide too. I wanted them to be mostly like one page.
We will rejoin our interview with Karen Pierce later on in the show. It is now time to unravel a real-life mystery. Have you ever heard of Olga Duflos? Her story is as baffling as any Christie novel. Her husband hadn't seen her in months, yet he's somehow connected to her tragic fate. Join us now as we dive deep into this intriguing true crime tale. Olga Duflos had made a fateful decision. Her marriage had become an unbearable burden. In 1950, she was the devoted wife of a respected doctor, living in the tranquil town of Sannois, just north of the romantic city of Paris. But ending her marriage wasn't as simple as signing a piece of paper. It was a complex puzzle with pieces of happiness, family, and property division. Olga and her husband Jean faced the daunting task of untangling their lives. Under French law, a divorce meant an equal division of their family property, which included Jean's lucrative doctor's practice. However, Jean didn't have the financial means to buy Olga out, and thus began a grueling process of negotiation, from the division of furniture to shared assets. The once loving couple had stopped speaking in February 1950, and by the December of the same year, they hadn't laid eyes on each other for 10 months. Olga had been battling a relentless illness for months now, and was confined to a hospital bed. She was fortunate to have a loving relationship with her mother and son, who visited her regularly, trying to lift her spirits with news and presents. Yet Jean's heart seemed to have turned to stone, devoid of the love that had once bound them together. As if the crumbling marriage wasn't enough, Olga's life took a tragic turn. Just a few short months later, she would meet her untimely demise. Her family were devastated. Olga had died at such a young age. But what was this mystery illness? Something didn't seem quite right. The doctors noticed it, and so did her family. It all came to a head on the day of Olga's funeral in January 1951. Jean dressed in a sombre funeral attire and was about to join the procession when a knock at the door shattered the silence. It was the police, and they were there to arrest him for Olga's murder. But here's the twist. Jean hadn't visited Olga once in the hospital, and they hadn't spoken in 10 long months. He vehemently protested his innocence, outraged by the arrest and the subsequent police interrogation. Little did Jean know that behind the scenes, the police had been working relentlessly. They discovered a chilling trail. Jean had purchased a disturbing quantity of sodium arsenate from various chemists across the city. Analysis of items found in Olga's stomach and her personal belongings revealed one terrifying commonality: arsenic. Jean was interrogated at Rue Bassano 42, a place that was tainted by its dark history as the former Gestapo stronghold where they had mercilessly tortured resistance fighters during the war. Unbeknownst to Jean, this address held even more provenance. It served as the headquarters for the renowned crime writer and former police detective Roger Jules Alphonse Bourniche. Bourniche had a remarkable police career, including an astounding 567 arrests. Little did Jean Duflos realise that in that very moment, when he was sitting in that police cell, one of the officers present that day would go on to achieve such greatness. Bourniche wrote 28 gripping crime stories. Possibly his most well-known work was Flick Story, which later became adapted into a film. In the pursuit of the truth, authorities decided to take Jean to the local bank. By this point, Jean's face had become well known in the local Paris press. As he walked into the bank, women who recognised him from the headlines screamed in horror, "To death! To death!" Inside the bank, detectives opened a box registered under Jean's name. Inside the box, they found a letter dating back 4 months. This letter contained information about returning Olga's jewels. The letter was indeed addressed to Jean, but it raised a burning question. Why would he need to return Olga's jewellery, and why had this letter been kept securely in the bank? His explanation was baffling. He claimed that Olga had started removing certain items of furniture from their shared home, and he wanted to secure his valuables before they all disappeared. Police finally unravelled a disturbing revelation. Jean had been methodically poisoning Olga's gifts, cunningly concealed within packages sent by her unsuspecting mother and son. Cakes, chocolates, biscuits, and even seemingly innocent bottles of water had all been laced with deadly arsenic. The final dose that Olga unwittingly took was hidden in a bottle of water and contained enough arsenic to kill 3 healthy people. In the wake of these horrifying discoveries, Jean found himself formally charged with Olga's murder and was incarcerated waiting his impending trial. However, fate had other plans and the trial would never come to pass. On Friday the 7th of March 1952, within the confines of Fresnay prison, routine checks were being conducted by vigilant guards as they made their rounds through the cell blocks. Yet, as they reached cell number 354, a chilling sight met their eyes. Jean lay in a peculiar and lifeless position on his bed. He had met his end through poison. Within his room, investigators discovered food parcels, their origins shrouded in mystery. The sender remains concealed forever. Dr. Jean Duflos, the poisoner, had ultimately received a taste of his own medicine. We now look at another poisoning, this time a fictional one, that of Rex Fortescue in A Pocketful of Rye. We rejoin the story with Rex Fortescue in the hospital. Inspector Neil arrives at the office where Miss Griffith, the head typist, gives him an account of the day's events, and Neil discards any implications that she was involved in poisoning Mr. Fortescue's tea. He is informed by the hospital that tragically Mr. Fortescue has passed away and the case has now turned from poisoning to murder. To everyone's astonishment, the cause of death is identified as taxine, a lethal compound found in the European yew tree leaves, but not its berries. Rex Fortescue lives at Yew Tree Lodge. The initial suspect, therefore, is Rex's young wife. But this is dismissed when she actually meets a grim fate after consuming a cyanide-laced tea, shifting the focus onto somebody else. The third victim is Gladys, a maid known for her romantic and gullible nature. Her life ends tragically with strangulation and a peculiar detail: a peg left on her nose. It is time for our astute amateur detective Miss Marple to enter the scene, and her attention is drawn to a peculiar clue: a pocket filled with rye on the victim. She soon uncovers a chilling pattern linking the murders to the nursery rhyme, "Sing a Song of Sixpence." We here at A Bit of a Christie never want to give away the name of the murderer, as we want to encourage you to read or reread Agatha Christie's work for yourself. Who do you think has done it? Could it be one of the secretaries in the office? Or a member of Mr. Fortescue's family? Could it be linked to his business dealings? And what about that link to the nursery rhyme? I wonder if you can figure it out. We now rejoin the fabulous Karen Pierce for the second part of our interview, talking all things food and Agatha Christie. Karen, how did you first become an Agatha Christie fan?
It was during school break, and we were shipped off to my grandmother's, and I was bored. It was raining, and I found an Agatha Christie on my grandmother's bedside table, and I sat down and read it. It was The Third Girl, and that was that. I read them all. I read them. I mean, I was young, so I read them all from the library. In my 20s, though, I started collecting them from used bookstores and places like that, and so I have a thorough collection that they're my comfort books. Like this, if things are going wrong in life, I just sit down and read a few Christies.
I do always think that's quite funny, actually, because for me as well, one of my greatest comforts is sitting down, either reading an Agatha Christie, watching one, talking to people online about it, listening to an audiobook, and really they're murder mysteries with quite a lot of death in them, but it's the thing that I find really, really comforting, and I always think that's a really strange idea.
It really is kind of it's because it's the order of it all, right? It's going to come out all right.
So back to the cookbook. Do I have to be an expert chef in order to follow these recipes?
Like this is not a big cookbook, how to learn how to make something. This is to explain food in Christie. And for a lot of Americans, they have no idea what some of these things are because they're very British, leaning. Like one, for instance, is a castle pudding. And I got to tell you, I don't know a single person on this side of the pond that has any idea that a pudding is anything other than, something you eat with a spoon.
So was that a difficulty in writing the book? Were these sort of cultural differences something that you had to research and overcome?
Yes and no. One, my mother's British. Most of these things I had heard of. But sometimes I hadn't. And, vegetable marrows, for one. Poirot throws them over the fence with a great deal of abandon. And I'm like, what the heck is it? Oh, it's an oversized zucchini. Like, what? So I had to have a long talk with one of my British friends about vegetable marrows. So that's one thing. Another, and this is an interesting one, is coffee cake. North Americans, view coffee cake as a cake you have with coffee. So it's probably got a little cinnamon in it. It's a little crumbly. Maybe there's fruit, maybe not. But in Britain, a coffee cake is simply a coffee flavored cake.
Do we know what kind of food the great lady Agatha Christie liked herself?
Well, I have read her autobiography and I'm on my third biography of her. So yeah, Agatha Christie liked a nice cup of cream.
Wow. Who
Yeah,
doesn't?
who doesn't? But yeah, she loved a cup of cream. So if everybody else is celebrating with champagne and great wines, et cetera, she's having a nice cup of cream. Her other favorite, she seems to adore lobster. She had lobster for like many of her big occasions, her 80th birthday, a couple of other things. She really did love a lobster and picked up quite a taste for caviar. She really liked food. And there's all sorts of wonderful stories. One of my favorites is she got the chefs when, her and Max, her second husband, were on archaeological digs in the Middle East. She would have cream made out of the water buffalo milk and put into eclairs and profiteroles. And she really liked to eat good food.
Out of all of the recipes in your book, which is your favourite?
I was thinking about that. Well, they're really all my babies now, aren't they? And I don't know. Are my favorites the one where I like the recipe the best? Or my favorites the ones where I like the mystery the best? Or the ones that were easiest to come by? Or the ones that I struggled with? I have no idea, but I am going to say that the chicken soup in After the Funeral is quite literally the best chicken soup I've ever had.
When you were researching the recipes, was there anything that surprised you from a modern point of view looking at these old recipes?
In Murder on the Links, which is a very early Christie in 1920s, and it's sort of set in France, we talk about having a steak. Poirot has a steak, and it's fried in butter, almost a half a cup of butter. I've got to say. So that's how they fried a steak back in the 20s. By the 40s, he's having a grilled steak with Fritz. By the 60s, he's in Miss Marple is in the Caribbean, and she's having a Caribbean open pit grilled steak. So that's been marinated with peppers and things. So kind of a bit of a progression on cooking steak. So
There is really something for everyone in the book, isn't there? And there's some salads as well for sort of a lighter meal.
an interesting one, it's beetroot and watercress. And that sort of takes place during the wartime when, all these things are at a scarcity, but you could always get beetroot and watercress.
It must have been quite challenging with some of the more complicated meals and recipes because in an Agatha Christie novel, it might mention what they're eating, but it doesn't necessarily say how it's made, what it's presented to look like on the plate. So how did you go about researching that?
I did a lot of looking up old menus at restaurants, menus on ships and railroads and things like that, because that would really give you a good idea of what people were eating at the time. Olives and celery were the number one condiment things served on every table. It was like the appetizer for everything.
During your research, were there many foods that you thought, we don't really eat that anymore. Should I include it?
So the ones I'm thinking of are kidneys, fried kidneys, which were from Five Little Pigs. And I wasn't, my mother and her sister made those ones and tried them out and gave me, my mother already had a recipe. So she just treated her sister to lunch one day and then they gave me the recipe. And Canapé Diane is also, again, bacon wrapped kidneys. And, these aren't things that people really have on their menus, but I included both of those.
Each of the recipes has some information at the top, some essay notes on the history of the dish and about the book that it's from, as opposed to just simply printing the recipe. Why did you think that was an important thing for you to include?
My original title for the book was A Food Companion to Agatha Christie. So I wanted to explain the food. Each novel has a quote where that is spoken about the food. And then I have a little bit about the novel and a little bit about the food, almost sort of in a 50-50 match. So you get a flavor of how this food fits into the story. And that's part of the glory of this. This is written by a fan for fans, and I really hope the fans enjoy it, because that's what I've really tried to do right for them. I have an introduction to each decade that tells you basically what the world was like during that decade, where Christie was doing during that decade, and how whether people had servants or not, whether there was a war going on or not. So you get a bit of an introduction to each decade, and then the books from that decade, who also then break out and give you a little more information, and then we move on to the next one. There's all sorts of fun things. I think that fans they're just going to enjoy this so much, just looking up, ooh, what did she pick for my favorite mystery?
Karen, you're from the beautiful city of Toronto in Canada, and I just wondered whether there were any Canadian authors, crime authors, that you could recommend for our listeners.
Well, I think the number one Canadian mystery author right now is Louise Penny, and I'm going to assume everybody knows who Louise Penny is at this point. So I picked two other authors. One is Ian Hamilton. Now, he is by no means new. His stuff is wonderful. His detective is Anna Lee. She's a Chinese immigrant who lives in Canada. So these books are very much split between kind of Hong Kong, China, and Canada, and very, very enjoyable. The other author is Robert Rottenberg, and he writes specifically about Toronto. They're fabulous little mysteries. They really showcase the city. I can't tell you how much I enjoy them. They're really, really good, and they're very, very Canadian, and they're very, very Torontonian.
If people want to follow you on social media or get in contact with you, Karen, what's the best way for them to do that?
To the Recipes for Murder Instagram site is probably the best.
Well, Karen Pearce, thank you so much for coming on to the A Bit of a Christie podcast. It's been a real pleasure to have you here and to learn about your book, Recipes for Murder, 66 Dishes That Celebrate the Mysteries of Agatha Christie.
No problem. Thank you very much. This has been great.
If you would like to buy Karen's book, it is available on all major internet bookshops and also from local retailers as well. For those of you who prefer to read in Kindle format, there is a download option available as well. There is just a little bit of time left at the end of the show, so we are just going to take a quick look at the song that inspired that work, Sing a Song of Sixpence, A Pocket Full of Rye. Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye, 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. When the pie was opened, the birds began to sing, wasn't that a dainty dish to set before the king? The king was in his counting house, counting out his money. The queen was in the parlour, eating bread and honey. The maid was in the garden, hanging out the clothes, when down came the blackbird and pecked off her nose. An interesting little rhyme that I'm sure many of us heard as we were growing up. Certainly it was a song that was sang in my household when I was small. But what does it mean? Is it purely a song about blackbirds being in a pie and a maid getting her nose pecked off by a blackbird? Well, let's take a closer look at this little song and see if we can figure out the clues that lie in the lyrics. The origins of the nursery rhyme Sing a Song of Sixpence remain uncertain. There have been numerous interpretations over time, and similar wording has been found in Shakespeare. In 1744, it was featured in Tommy Thumb's Pretty Songbook. But what do the birds and the king and the parlour represent? Well, Some have linked it to historical events and symbols. Some have associated it with celestial bodies like the moon and the sun, using blackbirds to represent the number of hours in a day, 4 and 20. Others have tied it to the dissolution of the monasteries, with Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn symbolising different figures within the rhyme. One false interpretation, however, that the song is linked to Blackbeard the pirate, and that the pocketful of rye relates to whiskey rations that were given out to the other sailors. Whatever the origin, the ending for me will always be that it is associated with A Pocketful of Rye by Agatha Christie. Thank you for listening. If you would like to contact us with some comments, then please find us on most social media at A Bit of a Christie. This has been A Bit of a Christie, and I've been Hazel Jones.